Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tim Richards, Technical Services Manager of the Managing General Agents Association. And on behalf of the MGAA, I'd like to welcome you to the fifth in our series of 6 sessions aimed at senior leaders and managers, looking at diversity, equity and inclusion, and how you can influence and implement the correct legal procedures and best-of-class culture within your own organisation. Before I introduce our presenter, I'd just like to run through a few housekeeping points. Please ensure your microphone and camera are turned off. If you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to use the chat button at the bottom of your screen. Time allowing, these will be asked and answered at the end of the event. So do put them through at any time and we'll catch up with those after the presentation. If we run out of time, questions will be answered post-event, and the presentation is accredited for CPD hours if relevant to your ongoing professional development programme. The briefing is being recorded and the recording and slides will be available in the members area of our website post-event. You will also be sent a feedback survey. This will take no longer than 2 minutes to complete and allows us to deliver the best possible training to our membership. So I'd like to introduce you once again to Holly Mapstone, Senior Human Resources Business Partner on behalf of our training partner Searchlight Insurance Training. Holly is an associate of CIPD with extensive board-level HR experience, including at HR director level, which is FCA certified. Her pragmatic and agile approach, combined with strong operational, strategic and commercial experience, delivers business improvements and cost savings whilst driving up employee engagement. Her passion is to create resilient and positive cultures which will help engage your teams and influence the business to execute excellence. So do enjoy the training, everyone. And Holly, over to you.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. I'll flick through the slides. So I can't really quite believe we're on to our 5th session already. I feel like we've covered quite a lot of ground so far in the ED&I space, but this is a really interesting topic to talk about with regards to inclusive communications and how that can support your management style and approach. I think something that is kind of all on top of our agenda at the moment. Obviously, Tim nicely read out my bio, so if we just jump straight in. So by the end of today's sessions, the learning objectives will be to be able to summarize your diverse audience and learn to identify and describe the unique backgrounds, perspectives and needs for the diverse workforce that you may have, and how you can evolve and adapt to become a more equitable leader. To explain the methods you can use to create an inclusive communication strategy or program within your business and team. This will allow you to discover effective strategies and communication techniques and promote inclusivity, engagement, collaboration, and making you an influential leader. And then finally, we're going to be able to describe the impact your management style may have in regards to your communication, and you'll look at internal and external stakeholders and KPIs within the business. You'll be able to outline what and how inclusive communication can revolutionize your leadership style, fostering an equitable culture, which is something that we all know is top of the C-suite and board agenda, and lead to make positive change. Quite a lot to cover in short space time, so let's just kick off. Again, as Tim said, please, any questions, pop them in the chat and I will look at them at the end. So first of all, as always, let's just explore some statistics. So 75% of communication received is incorrectly interpreted, and I mean that is just crazy when we think about actually the level of communication we do day to day. If 75% of it's actually not interpreted correctly, then that's a huge gap in terms of, you know, errors, risk, you know, how are we mitigating that for the business and for yourself. And then as we look into that a little bit deeper, 80% of people believe their business communicates poorly. Communication is always something that comes up in terms of, you know, aggrieved employees or teams, when there's lack of collaboration, etc. I'd be interesting whilst we go through this, if any of the businesses or leaders on this webinar, if anyone's ever ran any engagement surveys or focus groups, just kind of interesting to hear if actually communication is something that kind of keeps kind of coming up to the top of the list in terms of maybe weakness points or learning points to move forward with. So please feel free to let me know if you sit within those trends of that 80%. And so what does that mean if you have a multicultural team? So we've talked about diversity and how you recruit diversely, etc. So if you've got a team that is really diverse, then what challenges does that bring when you're communicating? So we're thinking about the challenges of maybe creating a common goal. These come from the CIPD diversity report. So they have reported that actually when you've got teams with great diversity, which is great, actually challenges with communication are to be able to create that common ground and that common purpose. Secondly, enabling others to work at their best. So just establishing again that equitable place where people can just work at their best and perform to a high standard. And thirdly, ensuring that fair treatment for all. So those three challenges, again, should be top of your priority in terms of trying to mitigate the risk for those. But again, interesting if you can share on the chat if you've kind of fallen short on any of those, or if you know that there are areas of concern that you'd like to look at. So now we've looked at the statistics, let's talk about, so where do we start? Where do we even think about this when we talk about communication? So this isn't earth-shattering, but everybody is different. We've talked quite a lot about this in previous webinars, but it really is true. Just because we communicate in a way and what we think good looks like from a communication point of view doesn't always necessarily come across to other people, and that is because everybody is different. Everybody's styles, preferences, approaches are completely different, and that's what makes them unique. And this means it's easy to kind of portray misunderstandings, which can then lead to potential conflicts. And we've seen in these statistics, if 75% is being interpreted incorrectly, then this is where we're having a lack of understanding around people. So why should we be worrying about this so much, about our audience, and not just putting the message out there and seeing if they can kind of cipher through what we're meaning? So in terms of creating a more inclusive communication strategy and method, if we can learn to adapt our skills, then the team cohesion will just naturally form. It will just naturally become better. The collaboration will be there. Clearer understanding goes without saying, which will in turn link into better performance, better engagement, better alignment with your business. The relationships within your team will become stronger. They'll foster better, stronger key stakeholder management relationships, which is absolutely crucial for a high-performing team. You'll improve your reputation as a team and in a business if you have a more inclusive communication style, and then greater appeal. So when we're thinking about maybe looking at recruiting and building your team, that kind of greater appeal around actually, what does your PR look like in the team? What is everybody saying about you as a leader? And that will build in terms of being able to have growth, better PR, and just better, I guess, establishment within different teams as well, across internal and external divisions. So broad appeal, it's actually quite rare that in working days we're communicating just on a one-on-one basis. Mostly we're maybe emailing multiple people, discussing things with our whole team, giving team huddles or team talks in front of a whole office, having discussions with large groups, putting things on websites, putting things on social media. You could be actually discussing things with thousands of people at one point. It is very rare that we're just having a one-to-one conversation. So by reaching many people, we don't know any, we can't reasonably expect to know everything about everybody that we're talking to, but it's just about having an understanding for maybe trying to create an inclusive communication that would be multi-purposing for multi-people. And that's why it's really important that we understand who's consuming our communication. So interestingly, the words are the smallest part in terms of our communication. So 93% of communication is non-verbal, and 38% of it is vocal, and 55% of it is visual. So when we think about that, when we're going into a conversation, or we're writing a podcast, a blurb or a social media post, or we're writing a team update, all we're focusing on is actually the words that we're using, but actually, when you're hosting team meetings or group discussions, we should be looking at actually it's non-verbal body language that's the most important thing. And the next quote really does support that. So Maya Angelou once said, "I've learned that people will forget what you've said. They'll forget what you did, but they'll never forget how they made you feel." And that does really resonate with me. I'm sure we can all think of a situation we've been in whereby maybe the messaging or the communication that you've been told hasn't necessarily been bad, but maybe how it's been portrayed to you has made you feel bad, and you never forget that. The scenario that I can pull on is I received some fair constructive feedback once in an appraisal, as does everybody else. But actually how it was portrayed to me actually it left me with a really bad feeling. And so it wasn't actually the content that was necessarily bad, but because I went away feeling as though I was made to feel that way during that situation, I always now have that very vivid feeling of that communication was bad, when actually it wasn't. The content was absolutely fine and reasonable. So it's really interesting just to think about, it's not always about what we say, but how we make people feel in those scenarios. And it's very quick for people to turn around situations if we're more in tune with that whole emotive side of communication. So personality types is a big one. So these are called the 5 big traits, which psychologists believe are building blocks for creating our personalities. They govern a lot about how we come across, how we perceive others. For example, we may be more calm, which we may then trigger a more introverted, conscientious personality. And then there may be more people that are completely agreeable to scenarios and in meetings. Some people you could maybe give state of change or change of direction on a project or a process. And because they're quite emotionally stable, they can deal with change very well, and they're very agile. And some are not. It's all kind of on this kind of spectrum. So you're kind of swinging on all these 5 traits. And this really then does impact how you do your communication with individual people. So just have a little think when you're seeing these on screen, and just try to almost, I guess, tune into yourself and think about yourself in terms of what personality types you think you are. And then we move on to processing styles. So this is the wide variety in ways people process information and how they're presented to you. And some people have different preferences based on that. So some people prefer reading material and some prefer listening. Some people prefer quite a lot of detail, and others definitely just like the highlights. I am very much a highlights person. Sometimes if people give me too much detail about information too soon, I can become quite overwhelmed. And also thinking about that, if someone is potentially dyslexic, it may be a case of actually providing them with too much text at one point in time when you're communicating a message can just become too overwhelming for them. Different processing in terms of words, images and sounds. So again, how do people like to learn, and what's their cognitive processing in that respect? Do people just like to have an email and read through it in their own time? Do they like to have a meeting with you and have that face-to-face verbal communication? Or are they quite visual, and could they maybe watch you do something and it's more of an imagery processing style? That kind of leads on to that understanding versus doing. Again, some people are quite practical in their learning, and again, this all influences the best way in which you can communicate with them. And then thinking and discussing. Some people very much like to have an agenda up front and have that thinking time, and want to go away and process it, and then others would be happy to discuss it as a live information as they're processing it. So again, think about that for yourself and just think, has any of that resonated with you in terms of what's your style? Okay, so let's go on to thinking about yourself. That's kind of really a good starting point, is understanding yourself better and your styles. There's a couple on the screen here of psychometric assessments and profiling. And I talk about this in a sense of, it's not a case of wanting to profile everybody and put them in a box, because it is a very fluid thing in terms of different scenarios can bring out different personality types and processing styles. But it's really interesting. If you can learn more about yourself, then it's encouraging then to be able to be more in tune with what your team are like. And a really important test that we always kind of promote but aren't affiliated with is one called Insights. I don't know whether, again, if anybody's ran that within their team for a psychometric assessment, but they work on a colour profile. So they will, on your assessment, they will put you into colour types depending on how you react under pressure, how you react in a team collaboration environment. And again, it's really interesting that your colour personalities and styles will change depending on your scenarios. So you may be a green person in terms of being very people focused, but actually when you're under pressure, your personality type may swing into red, and that kind of personality focus drops down. So again, it might just be worth thinking about if that's something you want to explore with yourself and with your wider team. So an introduction into neurolinguistic programming, some of this might be a new concept to some of the delegates on this call today, and it's something that's a really interesting topic and almost a webinar in itself. So we won't kind of do a deep dive into what that means, but NLP is a really fascinating subject if you wanted to kind of learn a little bit more about unconscious bias decisions, and particularly within sales teams, neurolinguistic programming is proven to help with sales techniques, so highly recommend. But in a nutshell, when we talk about NLP, it's actually talking about how we communicate to ourselves, and our inner voice actually then influences our thought process, and that unconscious bias decision, which we've talked about in previous webinars. And if our inner thoughts then affect how we relay and how we communicate, it affects our perspective, and then it affects our decision making, and then until that then influences the actual outcome. So the overall essence of NLP is that your inner voice and how you talk to yourself about decisions through the chain of events can actually influence the outcome. So again, it's really interesting to think about how we're preparing ourselves to do communications to our team for meetings, external meetings. If your inner thoughts are guiding you in a certain way, then it's more likely that the outcome will go the way that you're thinking. So again, if we're maybe fearful of a certain scenario, or if we're finding that we might come into conflict, if we're naturally thinking about that, then that will adjust our perspective on things, and in turn will adjust your decision making. So it's all very scientific, but really interesting to read up on that. So again, highly would recommend that. And then we think about perspectives. So remember, we said everybody is different, and everyone is diverse, from demographic factors to gender identities to race, age, and so on, and in so many different ways in which our brain works. You know, we've got social economic factors that come into the way that we see things, to our lifestyle and our experiences, and you'll know that from yourself and your team. You can view things in a very different light to the other people on your team, and all these different profilings will impact the way in which your perspective is altered. And again, it's just about having that that understanding and the empathy for the fact that perspectives are different, and not everybody's going to see things in the same light. So I'm just going to pause for a couple of minutes, and I'd be really interested if people can just pop in the chat their thoughts on what we've just discussed in regards to personality types and processing styles. So if everybody could just take a minute or two, it'd be really interesting just to see if anybody's had any thoughts on what their styles are. I'll leave this up, but I'll give everybody a minute or two just to pop some interesting things. And if you can maybe think of some scenarios in which you've been able to reflect and actually identify that you are a certain way. Like I said, I think I've said this in previous ones, I'm actually dyslexic myself. So in doing this learning process, I've actually learned a lot about myself in terms of communication over email. So that's been really, really helpful. So I'll just leave the chat up there for just a minute for people just to put their thoughts around their personality and processing styles. Nobody wants to share today. That is absolutely fine. Maybe have a think about it, and we will get some responses throughout. So I'll move on. Perfect. So we've talked about understanding ourselves and why it's important that we should be completely inclusive. So let's now identify the methods in which we're going to be communicating. So here are some options that we've got in the working way that we work now. A lot of things are done over multi-channels. So we've got face-to-face. Again, if people are working hybrid, then that's not always possible. You lose that option of eye contact, that ability to read people's body language. And like we said, a lot of it is not just verbal communication. A lot of this can be done over phone call, but again, do you lose that personal contact when you're doing those phone calls? Do you lose the inclusivity? I've got a little bit of noise in my background. Can anybody let me know if they can hear that? Because I'm just going to carry on otherwise. Can anybody hear the noise in the background? Tim might be able to let me know. No, perfect. Oh, okay. It will stop, I'm sure. Perfect. Okay, most people are good. That's fine. Thank you. So video calls. Has anybody ever been on a video call and they've had multi people on there, and it's kind of really difficult to find your place within a video call, I find, if you're discussing something new or having a team meeting. You know, how do you actually set up being able to give everybody a voice on that call? You know, you've been in scenarios where people talk over people, etc. Again, email, I think, is the biggest cause where miscommunication can happen. We're always told to follow up things on email and create an audit trail, which is great, but it's really important that we actually have that face-to-face, or we can see people's body language when we're talking about inclusive communications. We've got instant messaging now, and probably a lot of you use Teams. Again, that's quite quick and sharp. You know, people just like to fire things off. Again, is that suitable for certain communications? I don't know. Maybe revisit how often you use that. Social media is, again, a broader audience, so your tone and your language is a lot different. But again, thinking about, does that truly represent, if you're posting something on social media about a job or a new announcement within your team, is that really is that completely inclusive? We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. And then your written content for your reports and things, again, thinking about how we look into that. Okay, so using your words. So we've talked about language, and we've talked about, although verbal isn't the biggest part, it's still a huge part about this. So how do we use our voice to show empathy? You know, do we really engage with those conversations, or are you just there thinking of the next thing to say? Are you actually using the right language? We talk about language in a little bit more detail later on in the slides. Your tone is important. You know, have you got the right tone? Have you set the tone? If it's going to be a particularly conflicting meeting, then have you set the tone from the outset? Do people know the boundaries in which you're having that conversation? And body language is key. Like I said, most people, on how it's scientifically proven that when people are engaging for the first time, eye contact is actually the key point in which people try to form a relationship within the first sort of 15 seconds. You've heard that probably when you're interviewing, you kind of make a profile and an assessment on somebody within the first 15 seconds. Eye contact is absolutely key. That kind of goes with the caveat that if you're dealing with someone who's maybe particularly neurodivergent, that eye contact might be quite difficult for them. So just think about those in terms of how you're using your words and also your body. So when you're in meetings, you know, how do you share information? Is it something where you share things beforehand? Do you share an agenda? Do you share talking points? Again, thinking about tapping into those different processing styles. Do people like to have thinking time beforehand? Do people like to have information and detail up front? It's almost about giving everybody every option so that every learning style can be completely covered. What is the format? So how do you set the standard? How does everybody have a voice? We've talked a lot around different personalities throughout this whole webinar, and in previous ones around, some people are scared to speak up, they're not in a position where they feel comfortable to do so. So how do you create that format where everybody has a voice and everybody can contribute, whether it's in a different format to follow up afterwards if they don't necessarily want to speak in front of people? Where and how do they take place? Again, thinking about those formats that we just spoke about. Is it really an appropriate Teams meeting? Should this be done more face to face? You know, are you mind mapping? Are you having a difficult conversation? Should this be done face to face? So again, thinking about that. And then do you really need to have the meeting? Trending in HR at the moment is meeting-free days, which is actually music to my ears. But I know quite a lot of businesses at the moment are trialing a particular day of the week where it's actually prohibited to book any meetings whatsoever, and people can just get on with the day job. So just thinking about it, actually the content that you're discussing, does it really need to be a meeting that some people might actually find uncomfortable or not suited for their processing style? So interesting thoughts there. When you're conducting a meeting face-to-face or on Teams, you know, invite a range of people. So have you really thought about actually covering off all bases in terms of getting maximum input and performance and engagement from different people? Or do you just typically invite the same people that you always invite because you know they're quite vocal, they like to get involved in projects? You know, have you really thought about inviting all different people within the team? When you're at the meeting, you really need to clarify the purpose, why you're there, the objectives. Again, it's almost setting those expectations around what you're going to achieve. Circulate the information in advance is something I always promote. So whether it's a large meeting or something really informal, that could be a very small change you make to just your process in terms of circulate the information beforehand. You know, we've talked about that whole, have you got 5 minutes? Can we have a quick catch up? It immediately puts people on the defense. So again, if they're walking into meetings where they don't feel the information has been circulated and is inclusive, then you could be reducing their creativity and innovation. Guidelines for behavior, I guess that's particular if maybe you're coming into a challenging situation or you've got maybe two teams or two departments who are discussing something, and you may find that conflict is going to come from that. So make sure that you set clear guidelines over what behavior is acceptable. You yourself, I mean, if you're chairing it, you really need to, I guess, keep control of that meeting. Maybe we've all been there where we've been a manager and we've lost control of the agenda and the timings, and breakout conversations have happened and minutes haven't been followed up, etc. So really just keeping control is absolutely key. And then following up afterwards, that not only creates a good audit trail, but it also allows people with different processing styles to be able to maybe express their views and put their perspective on things that maybe they weren't feeling so comfortable to express. So how do we broaden our impact on our communication? So how do we make change? Firstly, really simple changes. I started off the meeting today by saying hello everybody. Quite a lot of people say hi guys, hi gents, etc. It's really important just to try to remain neutral when you're thinking about small changes to become more inclusive. When we think about jargon and maybe acronyms, there's probably quite a lot that are used within the industry. It's important to just remember that from a different perspective of your team, people come from all different backgrounds. That might be educational, social and economic backgrounds. So actually using jargon and maybe overinflated language can sometimes really prohibit people from joining in on conversations. So just reduce your jargon and your business talk to an absolute minimum. Just make it as simplistic as you can. Slang is an interesting one. We really need to think about, you know, reducing that just to reduce that the possibility of information being interpreted incorrectly. And idioms, I don't know whether anyone's ever heard of that, but idioms is when it's a phrase that you would use and you are assuming that most people know what the phrase relates to. So for instance, we're going to do things by the book. It's, you know, this is a 9-to-5 job. You know, it's trying to think of a non-business one, you know, it's raining cats and dogs. Those are the sorts of phrases that we class as idioms. And actually some people find those really hard to interpret, especially maybe if they're neurodivergent or just struggle with complete transparency. So again, doing things, say, we're going to do things by the book, people may literally think we're going to follow it word for word. So just again, just reduce the level of confusion that you can bring within your language. When we're thinking of email trails, we're going to keep things exactly to the point. I'm always a massive advocate for summarising and less waffle. Again, when we kind of talked about challenging conversations, there's not much point in putting a huge amount of waffle or a pre-rumble within your emails. Be absolutely clear on the purpose and think about the subject heading. Don't maybe overcomplicate the subject if you're sending emails and you want the communication to be clear and concise. Bullet points always to summarize, again, for those with different learning styles is really important. And state the tone. Again, that needs to be within your summary to start with. Is actually try not to blend your tone too much. If this is a stern and firm email, you need to make that consistent throughout. And again, if the tone needs to be slightly different for different audiences, then just make sure that you've got that consistency. And we talk quite a lot about websites because a lot of our communication, like we said, in terms of our audience is broad. And so let's think about how does your website, how does your team page, how does your intranet look in terms of a communication style. And this may be something that the marketing team or department within your business looks at, but having clear headings and action points is absolutely key. Having things spaced out, if you've, like you said, if you've got an intranet or if you've got a page for your team, that's always really key. Call to actions, so helps people with their learning processing. If you've got links which take you onto different pages, so press here, contact this, etc. You'll see these sorts of styles on websites. Color combinations are really interesting. So naturally in the UK, we normally put green text or green call to action buttons like click here or go there is a very positive action, and red would naturally be seen as something you wouldn't necessarily clicked on. And again, thinking of that broader impact, if you're maybe communicating with different sectors or different backgrounds, for instance, then colours can really influence the way in which people associate actions to those. So just don't always be assuming that green is always positive. And then imagery. You'll have lots of imagery on your website, on your social media channels and on your team pages. For those that maybe are visually impaired, that might not necessarily want to speak up about that, it's always really useful to put captions and alt text on those so that it will read things. Again, it's just small changes like this which will make you start to become more inclusive. And then we've, again, talked about this a lot, but active listening is absolutely key. So being aware of others and what they do in terms of their practicing and how they prepare, what they're going to say next. So when someone's talking to you, just really show that you're listening. Eye contact, positive body language, making notes what they're saying. It all gives really positive signs to actually coming into much more inclusive communication, repeating and clarifying and asking questions and leaving space. We touched on this a huge amount when we were doing the challenging conversations webinar, but I can't promote this enough, that actually when you're trying to have a conversation that's completely inclusive, this is the key point. Okay, so let's make a change. How can we make a change? We've talked about why, we've talked about who, and we've talked about what methods we use to communicate. So let's make a change. I think this all comes down to a clear understanding of actually what inclusive communication looks like. So what are the clear processes that you can use and your channels that you can use, and what would be appropriate? You would have clear guidelines, which we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail when we go through the action points, but asking for input. So again, there's this huge taboo subject that we shouldn't be asking maybe, or we don't want to ask and offend anybody, but actually asking for input is absolutely key in terms of how people like to understand information and how they like to be involved in meetings or on Teams calls, etc. And then it goes back to this continual development around asking for feedback, learning about people and that psychometric and profiling, and learning about different people's styles and perspectives, and having, I guess, the time and space to respect that things might be different. And then testing and analysing. So actually, did this certain communication style over Teams work? Did everybody read that Teams chat? Did things get miscommunicated on that email that you sent out with a brief? Does anybody read the board report you do? Are the images on the graphs really confusing? So testing and analysing actually what you put out to the teams and what you need them to understand, is that actually resonating with them? So interestingly, are we invested enough? I'm going to talk a little bit now around the FCA, because this is hugely influential from the FCA on what they're wanting to see. So you yourself may be invested as an individual, and then the business obviously needs to be invested from an FCA point of view, and what good looks like. So what do they want to see? So they want to see reasoning around decision making. This is from a recent report that the FCA have published. So reasoning around a decision making, they want to see detailed record keeping around communication. So have you got an audit trail? What does that audit trail look like? Are we making decisions and then not really considering the reasoning as to why we've communicated that in a certain way? They're looking to see that your communication style completely aligns with your culture. And that's a really tricky one, because it's very emotive, and everybody's styles and everybody's culture will be different. But this is a real big decision to make for the C-suite and the senior leaders of a business. But we need to really think about, does the communication and how we use different channels really represent us as a business? And does that align with what we stand for in terms of our cultural values? Your employees will need to feel empowered, and they need to speak up. So you need to have a trusted environment around. We talked a lot about psychological safety in the last webinar, but this is huge on the FCA's agenda in terms of inclusivity. And management need to be approachable and accountable. So some of these topics that we've talked about today, may seem like common knowledge, but it's quite easy to forget. And then when you're into a difficult situation where you're doing maybe a difficult conversation, have you just taken a moment to actually consider those things? Can you evidence that in that approach you have tried to remain as accountable as you can for considering other people's feelings and perspectives? And then Jonathan Davison, the former exec director from the retail supervision at the FCA, noted in an interview recently, it's not just about generating an authentic purpose and a safe speak up environment, but actually listening up culture is equally important. So it really is important to allow people to speak up, but you actually need to do something about it. There needs to be action. There needs to be active change that comes off the back of that, and what you do with that in terms of your communication is key. So action points that I think that the 5 key action points that we need to take away from today are: firstly, remap your internal communication policy. So as a HR professional, I would be recommending that all businesses have an internal communication policy, maybe slightly worded slightly different. So firstly, just go and check if you've got one, and that would be a great starting point. If you have, how long ago was that created? Is it generic? Is it just off the shelf? Is it just, mirroring some other policies? Do we need to remap that? So what would that remapping look like? So defining what your communication principles are key. And you could have an internal communication policy just for your team if you're sort of trying to lead the way, I guess, in terms of the business. So principal communication styles would be your preferred method of communication, and when you would use that. So you're stating when and why you like different people to use different channels. Defining what good looks like. So what sort of language do you use? The fact that you're empathetic, that you respect people's perspectives and backgrounds, that you're agile enough to know that different people's cognitive processing styles are different. So that is defining what your good look like. And how will your leaders and board embed this in review? So within the policy, you'll have sort of review periods, and you'll actually have mention around how the board will maybe conduct themselves in a similar way at board meetings. So it really does need to be top down, bottom up, from what we've seen in the FCA reports of late. Secondly, I'd be utilising all methods of communication. So we talked about different channels, different, are we overusing email? Are we using instant messaging? Are things getting missed? So think about that in terms of, can you actually just mix that up a little bit and utilise it so that effective methods are used for different types of communication? So you've got clear channels in which people know that set tones are for different channels. And what that could look at is, like I said, draw on your digital channels and tools. That is absolutely essential. Engage with your fellow leaders. So in terms of your senior leadership team and your board, make that to be common knowledge, have consistency across the group, and then drive genuine dialogue. So where you are doing hybrid working and where people are in the office, how can we increase that engagement so that actual face-to-face dialogue and just not emojis and GIFs aren't shared on instant messaging. And if you're posting something that's really meaningful to the business, how can you actually drive that engagement on that? So think about that in terms of your principal communications. Thirdly, embed psychological safety. I've not done a second slide on this because we did a whole webinar on this last time, but I cannot emphasize enough how important it is that psychological safety is embedded within the business in terms of supporting your inclusive communication strategy. Having people to have the well-being and trust to speak up in environments and speak out is absolutely key, and they need to be trusted, and there's no blame culture. So really just trying to embed that, and some of those strategies that we talked about in the last webinar is also key. Fourthly, increasing the accessibility and approachability to your comms. So what does that mean? So getting to know your team a little better. So firstly, could you consider psychometric profiling and assessments maybe at your next review, maybe at the next recruitment day? How could you introduce that within the team so it allows you to gain better accessibility to understanding? Create agility in your approach. So that basically means you need to just take a deep dive on yourself first to know what your styles are. And that is really, really crucial to just be able to relate to yourself first, because then you will know how you'll be able to be more dynamic in terms of other people's styles. And then genuinely invest in stakeholder relationships. So we talk quite a lot about how do we promote collaboration whilst we're hybrid working, and quite a lot of you will probably have done a massive recruitment surge since 2020. So you'll have a lot of new starters that will know nothing other than in your business as it being hybrid. But how do you create those genuine relationships so that people feel that they can express themselves in a way that is completely inclusive, and they are sharing their thoughts on things and projects and processes, and they are able to speak out. So think about that in terms of investing some time for team building, whether that's remote or in person, just allowing yourself some time to create different aspects of communication. And then lastly, develop an employee voice and brand. This might be something that the HR, marketing and senior leaders are already doing within the business, but this is something that you will see the FCA talking about more and more over the coming months. So the employee voice. So when we engage with an individual within the business, we talk a lot about the psychological contract. So you'll have your physical contract, which is your terms of engagement and your clauses that you will be abiding by, and you've got your policies. The psychological contract is the exchange of psychological terms and behaviors and conduct that kind of go under the radar. No one says them, but it's almost like your culture, how things are done around how people communicate, what happens if someone comes in, takes a longer lunch break. It's all those sorts of things that aren't written in a policy, that aren't written in your actual physical contract, but they form the basis for what your employee voice and culture looks like. So what does that say about you? Maybe do a little bit of a focus group or meeting just to say, what do you think the employee voice is? Do people have the space and time to discuss things, or do we deal with things appropriately? So just doing a bit of a deep dive into that. Review engagement scores and trigger points. I said earlier, if you've done engagement scores, I'd be highly surprised if anybody didn't talk about communication as part of maybe a gap or an action point for future improvement, because communication is always something that people are seeking further development on it. And it's sort of one of those things that you can never almost get 100% right all of the time. So that will be something that keeps rising up in terms of seeking further improvement. And does your team feel heard, fully informed, and are you a trusted leader? Ask them the questions. Are you telling them enough information in enough time in the appropriate methods? Do they ever have an email completely go off on a tangent and do something, and then you're reining it back in and saying, I didn't say that, I didn't mean that? Assess your own communication style with them, and what is the success of that? Are you living true to those unfortunate statistics that we spoke about in at the start of this slide? So just do a bit more exploring in terms of your management style. So where will you start today? I think we've covered off quite a lot. There's quite a lot in terms of external stakeholder management and policies and processes, and just understanding a little bit more about your team. But, you know, think today about, you know, making some small changes in terms of making it more inclusive, and kind of implementing a strategy that will help. I've inserted some further reading here. These are 2 books that I have read, and they are really pragmatic, really simple, paperback, very easy to share amongst maybe your supervisors that you might think that are, you know, amongst the succession planning, that might be stepping up into leadership. So again, maybe that is a way in which you want to embed that kind of employee brand and culture to become aligned with your comms, is spreading some training around what good looks like. And we've come to the end. So now hopefully you'll be able to summarize the diverse workforce and learn and be able to identify and describe different unique backgrounds, perspectives, and how to adapt to those. Explain the methods in creating inclusive communication to your business. And we've talked about different styles around how we promote and what language and tone we use. And then we described about the impact your management style has on that. So what can you do as a leader, those 5 things that we talked about, what can you take away today to actually make yourself a more equitable leader and make positive change? I'm open to questions. We are at the 45-minute mark, so I'm conscious of time. I'll open up the chat just to see if anybody has any questions. So Tim will probably pop back up now if there are any, but I'm just going to have a quick look. So we returned to doing at least 1 round of interviews face-to-face as we missed the non-verbal communication. I absolutely agree. Face-to-face interviews are probably one of the most valuable pieces of insight, I think, when you're taking on a new recruit. And as we all know, sort of recruitment and resourcing and talent shortages within the industry are prevalent. So yes, I think face-to-face interviews are probably one of my top go-tos when you're thinking about kind of using those non-verbal signs. I find large groups on video hard to gauge, especially when providing training. Even worse when you're presenting and you cannot see anybody's face. I agree. You know, the irony today, everyone's been asked to turn off their cameras and things, and I respect that. But it's interesting when that's not sort of a guideline for a call, and then everybody naturally does turn off their cameras. It just, you know, it reduces the level of engagement that the presenter can have in terms of tailoring the training, I guess, and making that more influential. We have too many meetings, usually face-to-face, with too many people and too much time spent on them. I agree. You know, I was in the office yesterday, and I naturally got pulled into probably about 6 face-to-face meetings, and it was just because I was there. And I said on 2 of them, do I really need to come in? And I think it was just because I was in the office that day. So yeah, just having that challenge around, is this really a meeting? Do I need to be in on it? Having a meeting-free day. Disruptive HR talk about that a lot. They're a really interesting company to follow also on LinkedIn. It was the previous HR director for BBC. She runs up now Disruptive HR, but she's a big believer of meeting-free days. And I am also in believer of that. We employ Thomas International Psychometric Tests as part of our recruitment process. Thomas International is one that I've used of late, and with the DISC model, they kind of profile you, and it's dominant, interpersonal, and they've got compliance in there. So I really, really rate Thomas International, and they give you interview questions as well based on that. I think it probably takes somebody about 2 minutes to do the assessment. So again, a really good one to go through with if you're just wanting to just do it for the recruitment process, if nothing else. I agree with your comment that it's important to know yourself and be able to understand others. Absolutely key. Perfect. If anybody's got any other questions, please feel free just to pop those in the chat. I'll just, I will look in a second. Let me just go through just to talk about, we've got one further live webinar that will happen in January, and further mini webinars and podcasts that will go up in the members area. But those are just obviously some of the discussion points that we've talked about over the last 8 months. And then further support is part of this offering with IHRS and Searchlight. I'll leave my details up on screen now with my email. I'm sure Tim will now jump in and allow you all to dip off and round up the call. But thank you very much for everybody for joining today. Hopefully some of the information was insightful for you to be able to move on within your business and create more inclusivity.
That's great. Thank you very much, Holly. I really appreciate that. And we seem to have reached the end of the questions as well. So it just remains for me to say thank you, Holly. That was fascinating. Really enjoyed that. And Searchlight for delivering our trading today. Do look out for session 6. And as Holly mentioned, that's in January. In fact, on Tuesday, the 23rd of January, 2024. So thanks to all of you for joining us. Don't forget to provide your feedback, please, and do look out for forthcoming MGAA events. Hope you all have a great afternoon. Thanks again for joining us, and see you all soon. Thanks, Holly.